So this question came up in the comments under another video, and I thought, why not go over it? It connects to both a recent video I did about commas before dependent clauses, as well as another video I had been planning to make involving dependent clauses following colons. And I'll say a little bit more about both of those issues in a second, but first let's just read the sentence. It says, interacting with animals, particularly dogs, is known to help people cope with stress because the prefrontal cortex helps individuals regulate and process social and emotional interactions. Neuroscientists believe that it might be particularly relevant to their research. Okay, so that's a long way to go without a hard punctuation mark. And by hard punctuation mark, I mean basically semicolon, period, or colon, or possibly dash. But we need to really be more precise than that and try to identify where we have independent clauses. And we have two in this case. One of them is here at the end, where it says, neuroscientists believe that it might be particularly relevant to their research. So that whole portion there is an independent clause. And then we also have an independent clause at the beginning where it says interacting, and I'm going to skip the little interruption there. Interacting is known. Interacting with animals is known to help people cope with stress. Okay, so we've got an independent clause in yellow, an independent clause in red, and then we have some stuff in between. And that stuff in between, well, that's going to be a dependent clause because the prefrontal cortex helps individuals regulate and process social and emotional interactions. Okay, so a dependent clause. Okay, so a dependent clause followed by an independent clause, you would use a comma, just like we have there. So no problems there, but they're not testing us on that portion. They're testing us on this portion. And so what do we want to do here? Well, what we can't do in a situation like this is just use a comma. Because even though there would be a dependent clause in between them, we would still essentially or ultimately be linking two independent clauses with nothing more than a comma. The only way that you could do that would be if you had a conjunction, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, in between them. Like an independent clause, a conjunction, and a second independent clause. Okay, but you can't do this. You can't string together independent clause, dependent clause, independent clause with just a comma, and so A is out. You certainly can't string them together without any punctuation at all, and so C is out. And then the problem with D is it's putting a dash after the word because, and the only scenario where I could ever imagine that being done would be if you had a second dash later on in the sentence, and then you had an interruption in here. And so that leads us to answer choice B, and that's going to have to be correct. Now, what that means is we have an independent clause followed by a dependent clause followed by a second independent clause. And while this is pretty rare, it's not unimaginable. This is actually a good example of something I had been trying to find an example of in response to an earlier comment. So this student correctly noted that you can't just have a dependent clause on the right side of the colon, as I had lazily or sloppily said in the video. But you can, as we do in the example in the current video, you can have a dependent clause followed by an independent clause. And again, that's what we have here. But another way to think about this, to connect it to other uses of the colon, we have what I would call the setup there in yellow, and that's going to go up to and include the word stress. And then we have what I call the payoff. Now, in this case, the payoff consists of those two portions, so I'll use the two colors. So by setup, I mean it is something that is creating an expectation, a sense of expectation. And then by payoff, I mean something that fulfills that expectation. So here, interacting with animals is known to help people cope with stress. How so? Well, Because the prefrontal cortex helps individuals regulate and process social and emotional interactions, neuroscientists believe that it might be particularly relevant to their research. Yeah, and so I was focused so much on the grammar earlier on that I didn't realize that, yeah, that's a little weird. That's not the best example of setup and payoff I could think of. It's known to help people cope with stress. Because it does this, neuroscientists. Yeah, that's a little bit strange, and this is, this connects back to another topic of a recent video, which is the sort of pitfalls of using unofficial test questions. Sometimes you get weird questions like this, and you really start to doubt yourself when it's really the test question or the practice question itself that is triggering some doubt. I would still say the answer is going to have to be B, because the others would give us run-on sentences or other errors that you just can't have. But this is not the best example of a colon situation. It's probably also an example of why you tend not to see this sort of structure after a colon, because it does result in a sentence that's somewhat difficult to follow. Again, you want your payoff to really be a payoff, and if it starts out with a dependent clause, even though it's acceptable from a pure grammatical / punctuation perspective, it can result in a pretty, again, convoluted sentence. But thank you for the question, and I hope this was helpful. Any other questions, comment below, and I'll see what I can do to respond.